Welcome back to another Swordmaster Publications presentation. My name is Ernie Lawrence, and today we're going to be studying Deuteronomy chapter 29. Now, we've just come off of the big chapter where the end of Judaism is essentially pronounced, the end of Israel, the great plagues and destruction that is what we see in the first century that happens to Judah and Jerusalem. Remember, the northern tribes had already been taken into Assyrian captivity and were no more at that time. But Moses really details in chapter 28 what was going to happen to them very specifically. But here in 29, we're seeing a little bit more of a move towards what is happening right then. What Moses is about to die. He's saying his final words here, and so what he provides in this chapter and moving forward is a kind of last, hey, do what you're supposed to do kind of thing. So we're going to touch on a few very important points here, and we're going to touch on some things that a lot of people may not have thought of before as they've passed through this chapter. So let's get started in verse 1. It says, "These are the words of the covenant which Jehovah commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab, beside the covenant which he made them in Horeb." So here's a few things here. First of all, it's the word covenant, this idea of a testament or a will or a contract, some kind of an agreement between God and the people. And he says this is beside or adjacent to or part of, it goes hand in hand with the things that he gave them at Horeb, which is Sinai, and it goes to the Ten Commandments. It goes to the building of the tabernacle, goes to the priestly garments, the building up of the priesthood, and assigning who would be priest. And it goes to all those laws that they got, what we read in the book of Leviticus. This is essentially a companion to that. That's what Moses is saying. Remember that in Exodus, at the end of Exodus and in Leviticus, that was at the beginning of their journey when those were written. Most likely, we even have the idea that Leviticus was probably chronologically written first. But then Moses came back also while they were in the wilderness and wrote Exodus and Genesis as well as historical events of what was going on. But here you have, instead of a focus on the priesthood and the sacrifices, you have a focus on the civil laws. This is a theocracy. Moses is giving the people the laws that they should live by, and that's what the word Deuteronomy means, is the duty of the people. I got a new cup because my last one broke, and it gets me through the day. So this covenant is part of that old covenant. It's part of what we call the Torah or the law of Moses. Okay, so it says in verse 2, "And Moses called unto all Israel and said unto them, You have seen all that Jehovah did before your eyes in the land of Egypt unto Pharaoh, and unto all his servants, and unto all his land." So remember, a lot of these people that he's talking to, these are the adults. They were the children. They were the people who were under 20 years old that came out of Egypt. So a lot of them had seen firsthand the plagues. They had seen the crossing of the Red Sea and the destruction of the pursuing Egyptian army. They had seen all the wonders and terrible things that had happened in those 40 years of wandering. So that's what Moses is referring to. And of course, there's a lot of people that are with them at this time, because we're 40 years later. There's a lot of people that were born in the wilderness, and they didn't see these things firsthand in terms of Egypt, but they saw the things through the wandering in the wilderness and the way that God treated them and reacted to the events, both good and bad. Verse 3, "The great temptations which our eyes have seen, the signs and those great miracles." So this encompasses all of the next generation that came out of Egypt here. We're about 4 to 5 generations now removed from Jacob, from the man Jacob. And he says in verse 4, "Yet the Lord, or yet Jehovah, has not given you a heart to perceive, and eyes to see, and ears to hear, unto this day." Okay, so what does this mean? There's a lot of talk in religious circles about God somehow entering into man directly, supernaturally, immediately. That means with no medium, and flipping switches, where we talk about Pharaoh and hardening Pharaoh's heart, or this king over here, and making this king do this, or how in the first century AD the Jews were blinded and deafened by God so that they would end up crucifying Jesus, which was the plan. And there's a lot of people that talk about that in a direct sense, so that God ultimately is the one responsible for sin. That's what it comes down to. But I want to examine here, and this verse here is a really good place to do this. I want to examine here the how and the why. When God says that He has not given them a heart to perceive, eyes to hear, and ears to hear, He's not talking about changing their immediate nature. He doesn't go into them and somehow make it to where their brains just aren't picking up the sensory input. We know that these are metaphors. We know that this is a accommodative language to help people understand what's going on here. God does not, your heart, when you talk about the muscle that pumps blood, your heart doesn't perceive anything anyway. It's not a sensory organ. And the people in the wilderness, they could visually see light would enter into the lens of their eye and hit the retina, and they would receive sensory input in the form of light, photons hitting the cones and the rods there. Their ears could actually hear sound. The tympanic membrane, what we call the eardrum, would vibrate, and that sense would be sent to their brain. So we're not talking in literal terms here that they were blinded and deafened, and then their heart didn't work, because they'd be dead. What this is talking about is their understanding, and where we are in the revelation of God's covenant, God's will to the Jews, is toward the end of that. And we're seeing here that God is establishing them. He founded the nation when they came up out of the water. After they crossed the Red Sea, they came up out of the water. That was when the nation of Israel was founded as a nation. They were freed from Egyptian bondage, and they became a new nation, a new creature, if you will, talking about the type, antitype of baptism. But they spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness while Moses was receiving all of this revelation and writing it all down. And so this idea of having a heart to perceive and eyes to see and ears to hear means God hadn't fully revealed everything to them yet. But here He is at the completion of the Torah, at the completion of Moses' law. And we've only got a couple of chapters left here. There's not many chapters left in Deuteronomy. And so we're coming to the end of that revelation. And so God is saying, now that you have the full picture of my will for you, you have essentially the full Constitution. Think about the United States Constitution. This is their Constitution. This is what makes them a theocratic nation. And so now, on this day, when Moses finishes penning this letter, this document, they have the fully revealed covenant in terms of the Mosaical law. Now, that doesn't mean that the rest of what we see in the Old Testament is not law or not binding or anything beyond that. It still is, but this is the core of it. This is God's rule set for them to live by. And now that they have it fully revealed, now they can see. Now they have text that they can read and do comparative study. And it's on this day that full perception of God's will is now available to them. And that's what that means. This is not a supernatural transformation that's going on with these people. It is about having the right information, God having revealed the right information to them. And I absolutely believe that in every case where God talks about manipulating somebody's heart, Like Pharaoh's heart is hardened, or somebody's heart is softened. You have hearts of stone versus hearts of flesh, the softened hearts of flesh, or all of the times when God is transforming people in terms of what they will and what action they're going to take. He's changing their mind by communicating with them in some way. And the person still has the free will, the true libertarian free will, to choose how to respond. God just knows them well enough to know what's going to press which buttons. He knew Pharaoh was arrogant and selfish and greedy. And he did not want to let these people go. Remember, this is the same Pharaoh that was so afraid of the Hebrews that he started killing off all the male babies. You would think that somebody who is afraid of these people would be glad to get rid of them. But there was such greed in his heart. There was such need to control. And God knew that. And so the things that God told Moses to tell him, God knew that would harden Pharaoh's heart. But Pharaoh is ultimately responsible for the hardening of his own heart. God didn't reach down into Pharaoh and force anything. He just communicated. And that's the same thing that we see with the Jews in the first century. God did not miraculously, supernaturally, overwhelmingly reach down and overshadow the Jewish state so that it couldn't perceive what it should have perceived. He just communicated in a method, in a way, that prevented them from doing so because of their own choices. We see the Jews, the way that they respond, that they were positive. There was a lot of them that got converted, that were followers of Christ. And then after the fact, when the things that Jesus said came about, that revealed information communicated to them, oh, we were wrong. We see 3,000 of them repent on the day of Pentecost. So that's what is meant by this. And it's a powerful verse here, because I think the unto this day especially really gives us the clue as to what God means when he talks about manipulating people's hearts and blinding them and making them deaf versus giving them eyes to see and ears to hear. That's what you see in Revelation. He that hath an ear, let him hear. Well, that means somebody who's been paying attention, who's been listening to everything that God has been revealing to the church during the first century. If you read Revelation and you've been paying attention, you've been listening to God, you are going to understand. It doesn't mean you've been given some kind of special ability or miraculous ability. It just means you've been paying attention to what God has been communicating. And I think that's super powerful, and I think a lot of people need to understand that. All right, verse 5. And I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes are not waxed old upon you. Your shoe is not waxed old upon your foot. He supernaturally preserved all of their belongings so that they could get through the wilderness, because they didn't have the means of production. They were nomadic, and they didn't have crops to grow. They didn't have access to the things that they needed really to settle down and make textiles or to make shoes very well. And so God just miraculously preserved everything for the 40 years that they were in the wilderness, again showing his providence to them. And then he says, you have not eaten bread. Obviously they had the manna from heaven. What he's saying there, that word bread, is just you haven't had normal food. You've been eating a very sparse nomadic diet that I have provided, specific things that I have provided for you. You haven't eaten normal food. You haven't eaten your heart's desire. Well, you're about to come into this land full of bounty that I'm giving you, and then you can have whatever you want to eat within my laws. And so that's what that eat and haven't eaten bread. Neither have you drunk wine or strong drink. Why not? Well, they don't have vineyards. They don't have any way to produce it. They don't have any way to make it. Interesting fact here, he's talking about things that they didn't have in the wilderness that they would have in the land of promise. So they're about to have wine, alcoholic wine and strong drink, the yayin and the shakar. And so God's going to bless them with those things. So under the Old Testament, they were definitely authorized to drink wine and strong drink. One of those kind of Church of Christ things that is kind of silly, people condemning the use of alcohol outright as opposed to the responsible use of it. But anyway, it says that you may know that I am Jehovah your God. He's talking about providence. He's talking about what he's provided for them. They needed these things while they were in the wilderness, but looking forward to the bounty that he was going to provide for them in the promised land. And when you come into this place, or when you came into this place, Sihon the king of Heshbon and Og the king of Bashan came out against us unto battle, and we smote them. So he's talking about the land that they're in right now, kind of north of the Midianites and the Amorites and all those. They're on the eastern side of the promised land, getting ready to go in. They'll head right into the middle of it, if you will. The north and the south kind of evenly split. But when they got there, these guys, Sihon and Og, came at him. Og was the giant. Remember, he had a huge bed and everything, and they got taken out. And the significance of Og being taken out is, remember, 40 years ago, they were all freaking out about the giants. They were scared of the giants in the land. But Og is a king. He's a giant king. And they took him out. It wasn't any problem because God's on their side. And we took their land and gave it for an inheritance unto the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh. So remember, Manasseh, half of the half tribe gets out here, and then the other half of the half tribe, Manasseh, is going to be in the promised land itself. So he says, keep therefore, in other words, I've done all of this, keep therefore the words of this covenant and do them, that you may prosper in all that you do. Now here's one of the big contrasts between the Old Testament and the New Testament. God is providing physical blessings, physical bounty to a physical nation that is the type pointing to the New Testament church. He says, if you obey me, you will prosper. And there's a lot of people today that are trying to preach what is called the prosperity gospel. If you obey God, he will cause you to prosper. You'll have all this money, a big house, fancy cars, and whatever kind of physical things that you should ever desire, because God promised to bless you. Well, why did God bless Israel that way? He blessed them to preserve them, to bring Messiah into the world. They needed to be preserved physically. The church doesn't need that. The church is going to be around, but it's a spiritual kingdom with spiritual blessings. Our prosperity is in our spiritual blessings. God never promises in the New Testament to provide more than the basic necessities, your basic physical necessities. You know, he provides clothing for the flowers and for the birds. He's going to provide the clothing and the food and the shelter for you. But he never promises you anything. That's why the idea that mansions in heaven is so ludicrous. We aren't focused on the physical wealth. It's irrelevant. Our focus should be spiritual wealth. So when God talks about us prospering in the New Testament, he's talking about if we are out doing the Lord's will, we're going to convert more people. We're going to build up the church in terms of its number and its quality. And so we shouldn't be looking, we're going to be tempted, we're going to be persecuted, we're going to be put under trial. Look at all the horrible things that happened to the Christians for their faith. There wasn't much prosperity physically going on, but spiritually they exploded all over the world. There was just conversion after conversion after conversion. And so I wanted to highlight that difference here. Verse 10, you stand this day, all of you, before Jehovah your God, your captains of your tribes, your elders, your officers, with all the men of Israel, your little ones, your wives, and the stranger, that's the proselyte that is in your camp, from the hewer of your wood and to the drawer of your water, that you should enter into covenant with Jehovah your God. So here we have the establishment, the final full establishment of the kingdom when they are brought into the promised land. And I want you to understand the parallel here. The church was established at the cross, went through 40 years of wandering in the wilderness of persecution by the Jews, a little bit by the Romans at the end, but mostly by the Jews, as they were receiving their revelation from God, that is the New Testament letters that we call the New Testament, those 27 letters. And then on the other side of the end of the Jewish state, after the Jewish wars happened, there was an end to that establishment period, and God brings about a fullness to that covenant, to that new covenant. There's a massive parallel here. And so entering into the covenant, when we see the inheritance, the speaking of inheritance in the New Testament, that you'll inherit the kingdom, that there's this inheritance that's coming, there's all this talk of this future inheritance or whatever, it's not talking about heaven. It's talking about the full establishment of the church and an end to the infancy of the church and into the need for continuing revelation. It would all be fully revealed, and we would fully enter into that covenant after that establishment period with God, because he had revealed the whole New Testament. When the book of Jude was written and all the other 26 books were written and handed down, 2 Peter 1:3 says that all things that pertain to life and godliness had been given to the apostles. Jude 3 says that the faith was once and for all delivered to the saints. That was it. And it was a full covenant. That's why we call it the New Testament, the New Covenant. That whole thing is everything that God is going to reveal. And in that sense, you go back up to verse 4, in that sense, we were given that full heart to perceive, eyes to see, ears to hear. We could see as if in or we're no longer looking in a glass darkly, like 1 Corinthians 13 talks about, but we could see as if we were looking at ourselves face to face. That all goes together. Every bit of that goes together, and it's paralleled here. If we understand what's going on here, then we understand how it works in the New Testament, what all of those ideas mean in the New Testament. We're not really talking about looking forward to heaven a lot of the times that people say we're talking about heaven. Doesn't mean that the New Testament doesn't ever talk about heaven. It just means a lot of the times when they're talking about our inheritance and the kingdom, it's talking about after that 40 years of wandering in the wilderness of Jewish persecution, that we would come to our full establishment. We would come into the full idea of covenant with God, because the covenant itself would have been fully revealed. That's what all that means. That you should enter into the covenant with Jehovah your God and unto his oath, which Jehovah your God has made with you this day. The oath, the promise of what he was going to give you. He's talking about entering into the promised land. What is our promised land? What is our new land, our new earth? That's the church after the Jewish state is removed out of the way. So did the Israelites exist? Yes, they were a nation, but were they in their land? Did God fulfill the promise of the new land to them, this covenantal land? He does 40 years later. When does the new land, the new earth, come into effect, the inheritance for the church? 40 years later. Like, it's so parallel. It's so easy to see once you have all these keys and you understand the Old Testament the way that you should. That he may establish you today for a people unto himself. But God, didn't you found them when they came up out of the sea? Didn't you make them a people for yourself? Yes, he did. But now he's fully established, and there's a difference between that word founding and establish. Establish means you've been firmly set. You've been given all the things that you need, and he doesn't have to hold your hand like a little child anymore. And the same thing happens to the church. He founded us at the cross, and we were babes, and the church was an infant, and it grew for 40 years with the hand-holding of miracles and the delivery of the New Testament. And then you have the revelation there of the scriptures given to mankind, and at the end of that, they were fully established. And it says, and that he may be unto thee a God, as he has said unto you, and has sworn unto your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Neither with you only do I make this covenant and this oath. Now pay attention here. This is so valuable. He says, I'm not making this covenant with you here, standing here today, but with him that stands here with us this day before Jehovah our God, and also with him that is not here with us today. What is God saying? This covenant is not just for you guys that are alive right now, but there's going to be 1,500 years of Jewish state, of the Israelite nation, until Messiah comes. For everyone who is part of that going forward, I'm making this covenant. It was going to be with physical Israel. Now, think about the New Testament. Was the New Testament written to the church of the first century? Absolutely. And it is important to understand that when you're reading it, or you're going to miss a lot of things. But is the new covenant established only with the Christians of the first century? Absolutely not. It is not just for them. It is for everyone that comes after. Everyone that was not there that day in that time period. Type antitype. So powerful. To understand, why does the New Testament apply to us today? Because when God made a covenant with the church of the first century, he was also making a covenant with the church for the rest of time, for everyone that was not in that day. And if you get that, then you are drawing, you're not talking about just a momentary thing, but an ongoing thing, that we are taking part in that new covenant today. Then he says, for you know how we have dwelt in the land of Egypt, and how we came through the nation which you passed by, talking about all the different nations in the area and the trouble that they gave them. You've seen their abominations and their idols, wood and stone, silver and gold, which were among them. It's all these fake false gods that don't actually do anything. They don't have any real power. They're just rocks and stone and wood and stupid stuff. Lest there should be among you man or woman or family or tribe whose heart turns away this day from Jehovah our God to go and serve the gods of these nations, lest there should be among you a root that bears gall and wormwood, and it come to pass, when he hears the words of this curse, that he bless himself in his heart, saying, I shall have peace, though I walk in the imagination of my heart, to add drunkenness to thirst. Jehovah will not spare him. But then the anger of Jehovah and his jealousy shall smoke against him. That's that idea of, we kind of think of like maybe comic books where somebody's mad and you see a little steam or smoke up above their head. It's so angry that it's visible against that man. And all the curses that are written in this book shall lie upon him, and Jehovah shall blot out his name from under heaven. So no one saved, always saved in the Old Testament. No one saved, always saved in the New Testament. But here you have God saying, if somebody has read all of this and understood all of this, seen all the things that God has done and continues to do for Israel, and then they say, you know what, I understand all of that, but I'm going to do what I want to do anyway. That's the imagination of the heart. Then I'm going to be okay. God's not really going to do anything to me. God says, I will not spare him. And in the Old Testament, that absolutely meant death, like just absolute physical death, because we needed to understand how important it was when God said something, he meant it. Don't have that under the New Testament, because we have the Old Testament to look back to. And in the New Testament, God does not immediately strike people dead for the most part. Of course, there's the whole Ananias and Sapphira thing and a couple other things during that establishment period when miracles were still taking place. But today, God doesn't do that. But there are immediate consequences that we face when we have the same kind of attitude. And God says to the church, you excise that person. You disfellowship them, get them out of your number so they don't corrupt you. Then the last part here, so that the generation to come of your children shall rise up after you, and the stranger or the proselyte that shall come from a far land shall say, when they see the plagues of that land and the sickness which Jehovah has laid upon it, and that the whole land thereof is brimstone and salt and burning, that is not sown nor bears, nor any grass grows therein, like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah. There's again that spiritual comparison of Israel to Sodom and Gomorrah. Admah and Zeboam, which Jehovah overthrew in his anger and his wrath. Admah and Zeboam are the other two towns. Remember, there's 5 city-states in Lot's area, and only Zohar, I believe it was the one that was not overthrown, because Lot went to live there for a little bit. But they were destroyed. And God says, people of generations to come, if you guys disobey me, and it comes time, I will absolutely remove you, just like talked about in chapter 28, and you're going to be a watchword. You're going to be a warning to everyone. And that's exactly what happened. They were absolutely and utterly destroyed. Listen to this. Even all nations shall say, wherefore has Jehovah done this unto this land? What means the heat of this great anger? It's going to be so amazing and terrible what God does to them. All the nations for all time to come is going to look back and say, wow, God's own people rebelled against him, and look how he dealt with them. The whole book of Isaiah is nothing but that message. You want to be like the nations around you? This is what I'm doing to the nations around you. I'm destroying them for their wickedness. You keep trying to be like the nations around you, I'm going to destroy you too. That's the whole message of Isaiah. And it's all messianic. Every bit of Isaiah points in that direction. But Isaiah is drawing off of this right here. Verse 25, then men shall say, because they have forsaken the covenant of Jehovah God of their fathers, which he has made with them when he brought them forth out of the land of Egypt, for they went and served other gods and worshipped them, gods who they did not know, and whom he had not given unto them. The anger of Jehovah was kindled against this land to bring upon it all the curses that are written in this book, and Jehovah rooted them out of their land in anger and wrath and great indignation, and cast them into another land, as it is this day. This is exactly what happened. They went after other gods, they went after other nations, they trusted in those physical nations instead of God. They broke the covenant, and when God had fulfilled his part of the covenant by bringing Messiah into the world, what did he do? He utterly destroyed them. And to this day, they don't exist. Yeah, there's a nation over there calling itself Israel, but they're not the Israel of the Bible. They don't do anything of the Mosaical covenant in terms of the Levitical priesthood and the temple and the sacrifices. All they have is their rabbinical traditions, which isn't biblical, isn't Torah, isn't keeping what Moses set up as a theocracy. They can't. They don't have a way to determine who is a descendant of Aaron anymore. And so this idea of this utter destruction and the nations looking and saying, wow, if he'll do that to to his own people for disobedience, who are we? What's God going to do to us? Then verse 29, he finishes up. The secret things belong unto Jehovah our God, but those things which are revealed belong unto us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law. This goes right back to what I was saying up above about the difference between not having a heart that understands or eyes that see and ears that hear. They hadn't had the full revelation yet. But those things which are revealed belong to us. Now they did. Now there are some things that God keeps to himself. He's omniscient. He knows so many things so far and above everything that we could possibly know with our finite minds. So he doesn't reveal everything there is to know. But the things that are revealed, we're responsible for. And we have to keep his commandments and keep his laws because he knows better. He's our creator. And once he has revealed to us, which he has done, all that we need, then it's our responsibility to read it, to understand it, and to keep it. Hope this has been a good chapter. It has been for me. It's a very exciting chapter. I've loved going through this study so far just because there's so much that can be gained by studying these as a mature Christian. There's so much that we see pointing towards the first century church and its establishment, and it's just so powerful. So I hope you've gained something from this. We've been studying Deuteronomy chapter 29. My name is Ernie Lawrence. I'm looking forward to your questions. Please send those. I love discussion with you guys when you all send me questions about this stuff. But anyway, this has been another Swordmaster publication presentation, and we'll see you next time.